If someone had told me years ago that I would one day fall in love with my best friend's father, I would have laughed it off as impossible. Love, I believed, followed rules. You met someone your age, you clicked, and life carried you along the well-marked paths people expected. My life, however, had other plans. Plans that surprised me, challenged me, and eventually brought me more peace than I ever imagined. My name is Daniel, and when all this began, I was just 19. I grew up in a quiet town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's stories before they even finished living them. My family was modest, my childhood ordinary. I had a small circle of friends, but my closest was Ryan. We met in middle school. When we were paired up for a science project neither of us cared about. What started as two boys rolling their eyes at school assignments turned into a bond that carried us through high school and beyond. Ryan was the kind of friend you could call at 2 a.m. when life felt too heavy. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was loyal, funny, and good-hearted. His house became my second home. Sometimes it felt easier being there than being in my own. The warmth of his family contrasted with the quiet distance of mine, and in those walls I always felt welcome. It was during one of those weekends, after high school let out for summer, that I first really noticed his father. I had seen him before in passing, of course. A tall man, carrying himself with quiet confidence, the kind of presence that filled a room even when he didn't say much. His name was Michael. I always addressed him formally, Mr. Carter, because that was how I had been raised. But the truth was, even then, there was something about him that made me pause. He wasn't just Ryan's dad. He was different. Maybe it was the way his voice carried a calm steadiness, or the way he listened, as if your words mattered more than you believed. I remember the first real conversation we had. I had stayed over at Ryan's house after a late-night movie marathon, and in the morning, while Ryan was still asleep, I wandered into the kitchen. There he was, already awake, reading the paper with a mug of coffee in his hand. "Good morning, Daniel," he said, like he'd been expecting me. His tone was warm, unhurried. I muttered a sleepy reply, but he only smiled and poured me a cup of tea, somehow remembering I didn't drink coffee. That small gesture stuck with me more than I wanted it to. Back then, I didn't think much of it. It was just kindness, I told myself. Just an adult being thoughtful. But looking back, I can see it for what it was. The very first moment something stirred quietly inside me. Something I would spend years trying to understand. Love doesn't always knock politely at the doors we prepare. Sometimes it slips in through unexpected cracks. Quietly, patiently, until you realize it's been shaping your story all along. The first time I ever walked to the door of Ryan's house, I remember thinking it didn't feel like a stranger's home at all. Some places carry a certain weight when you step inside, as if the walls have been listening for years. This house felt lived in, warm, full of stories I hadn't heard yet. There were framed pictures in the hallway. Ryan as a toddler with cheeks smeared with chocolate. Ryan in his Little League uniform. A family photo where his mother smiled with her arms around them both. But she was gone by the time I came into the picture. I'd only ever heard that she had passed away when Ryan was still a kid. That absence lingered quietly in the air, like a room missing one piece of furniture. Not loud, not overwhelming, but always there. And then there was his father, Michael. He greeted me the first time with a polite smile and a handshake firmer than I expected. He had the sort of presence that made you stand up straighter without realizing it. His hair was touched with early silver at the temples, and his eyes, blue-gray, steady, met mine in a way that felt both formal and kind. He wasn't the kind of man to waste words, but when he did speak, you listened. "Welcome, Daniel," he said, as though the house belonged as much to me as it did to them. "Make yourself at home." I nodded nervously, mumbling my thanks, and followed Ryan up to his room. But all the while, a part of me kept replaying that first look, that first greeting. It was silly, I told myself. It was just respect for an elder. Nothing more. Over the weeks and months, I found myself spending more and more time at Ryan's. Homework turned into late-night game sessions, which turned into weekend stays. The house, which had once been foreign, began to feel like a second skin. And whenever I was there, his father was a constant presence, not intrusive, never hovering, but simply there. He had a way of showing up in small, thoughtful moments. A plate of sandwiches carried upstairs when we'd been working too long. A question about my grades, asked with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Once, when my bike chain broke in the driveway, he fixed it without a word, just crouched down, wiped his hands on a rag, and handed it back to me with a nod. It wasn't just what he did, it was the way he carried himself. A quiet dignity, a respect that seemed to extend to everyone, no matter how small the interaction. But beneath that, I began to sense something else. An emptiness, perhaps an aura of someone who had given much of himself to others, but was left with quiet loneliness when the house went still. I noticed in the evenings, when Ryan would be blasting music upstairs, and I'd find myself wandering into the kitchen for a drink. There, Michael would sit alone at the table, reading a book or flipping through old newspapers. He'd look up, offer me a smile, and ask how I was doing. Simple questions, yet they felt different. When he asked, "How's school treating you?" it didn't feel like idle small talk. He waited for an answer, listened, nodded thoughtfully. It was unusual. Most adults ask questions just to fill silence, but not him. One night, when Ryan had fallen asleep during a movie marathon, I padded into the kitchen and found Michael rinsing dishes. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I was intruding. He noticed me and gestured toward the counter. "Can't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not really." Ryan conked out in the middle of the second movie. He chuckled softly, the sound warm but tinged with something heavier. He's always been that way. Starts strong, but never makes it to the end. I laughed too, and before I realized it, we were talking. Not just about Ryan, but about books, about how he managed work and home life, even about how I was planning my future. He offered advice without lecturing, stories without bragging. There was a stillness in those conversations I couldn't explain. It wasn't romantic, not then, not even close, but it stirred something inside me. A quiet admiration, the kind you don't often feel for people outside your own family. When I went back upstairs that night, lying awake in the guest room, I tried to brush it off. He was just my friend's father, a man who had lived through more life than I could imagine. Of course I admired him. Of course I respected him. That was all it was. At least, that's what I told myself. But even then, some part of me knew the truth. Respect was a seed, but something else was beginning to take root. Something I didn't yet have the courage or the language to name. The visits became routine before I even realized it. At first, I went to Ryan's house because that's what friends did. Study sessions before exams, late-night video games, lazy weekend afternoons. But somewhere along the way, the rhythm shifted. It wasn't just Ryan I looked forward to seeing anymore. I'd never admit it out loud then, not even to myself. But every time I walked up that driveway and rang the bell, part of me hoped his father would be the one to open the door. Michael's greetings were always steady, always the same, yet they carried something that drew me in. Sometimes it was a simple, "Good to see you, Daniel." Other times it was a question, "How was your week?" Or, "Did that exam go the way you wanted?" He remembered things, small things I had mentioned in passing. A teacher I struggled with, an essay I was nervous about, even a book I said I was reading. He listened, and in a world where teenagers often felt unheard, that meant everything. Our conversation started small, in the spaces Ryan left unfilled. When he went to shower, when he dashed to grab snacks, when he fell asleep before midnight. Those were the moments I'd find myself sitting at the kitchen counter while Michael prepared a cup of tea, or leaning against the porch railing while he watered the plants. He never pushed. He never acted as though I was an intruder in his time. Instead, he welcomed those pauses as naturally as if they belonged. One Saturday, Ryan had gone upstairs to take a phone call that stretched into nearly an hour. I stayed behind in the living room, flipping through a book that wasn't mine. Michael walked in, carrying a mug, and noticed. "You like history?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my hands. Sort of. I replied, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm better at English, but history feels like stories, so I don't mind it." He smiled, settling into the armchair across from me. "That's all history really is. Stories, except with the burden of being true." We ended up talking for nearly 40 minutes, Ryan forgotten upstairs. He told me about his college days, how he had once dreamed of teaching before life pulled him into business. He spoke of choices, of roads taken and not taken. I sat there, soaking it all in, feeling as if I were hearing pieces of a novel only he could tell. I didn't recognize it then, but I was drawn away. He shared his world. Not flashy, not dramatic, just honest. Every word carried weight. Every pause invited thought. Over time, these moments stacked up, one atop the other. After school, I'd sometimes suggest to Ryan that we study at his place. Not mine. He never questioned it. To him, his house was just his house. To me, it was slowly becoming something more. I began to notice things about Michael beyond his words. The quiet patience in the way he folded laundry, the faint crease in his brow when he read the newspaper, as though carrying the worries of the world silently. The way he asked about my future, not in the abstract, but in specifics. "What do you want to do after college?" he asked one evening, when Ryan was upstairs playing his guitar far too loudly. I shrugged, embarrassed. "I don't know yet. Maybe writing. Maybe teaching. My family thinks I should do something practical." He nodded slowly. "Practical is fine, but don't let it drown out what matters. You'll spend most of your life working. Better to give those years to something that keeps you alive inside." I don't know why those words struck me so deeply, but they did. They felt like permission, something I hadn't realized I needed. The more time I spent around him, the more my perspective shifted. With Ryan, things were light and easy, jokes, games, distractions. With Michael, there was depth. Talking to him felt like standing at the edge of something vast, something steady. I admired him for that. I admired the way he had lived, the quiet strength he carried even when no one was watching. It wasn't sudden. There was no lightning bolt, no single revelation. Instead, it was like water carving into stone, slowly, silently, reshaping me without my notice. Looking back, I can see it so clearly. Admiration turning into something gentler, warmer. But in those days, I clung to the word respect. It was safer that way. I told myself I respected him the way a student respects a mentor, the way a son might respect a father. Nothing more. Yet there were cracks in that shield, like the way my chest tightened when he laughed at something I said, the laugh carrying a softness I wanted to hear again, or the way I felt an odd spark of joy when he asked for my help with something as simple as moving a box in the garage, trusting me to share in his small tasks. It confused me. It scared me, too, because it wasn't supposed to be this way. He was older, wiser, my best friend's father. I told myself those lines mattered. They kept me from wandering too close to the truth. But sometimes, late at night in the guest room, I would think about those conversations, replay them in my head. The encouragement, the kindness, the quiet ways he saw me, and a whisper in the back of my mind asked, was this really just respect? I pushed the thought away. I wasn't ready for the answer. Not yet. It's strange how the smallest things can carry the heaviest weight. A cup of tea, a remembered detail, a glance across a quiet room. Tiny moments that, once noticed, refused to be forgotten. That's how it began for me with Michael. Little signs that I tried to brush aside, but couldn't. One evening after school, Ryan and I came home exhausted from a long practice session for a debate competition. He immediately collapsed on the couch, groaning about how tired he was. I wandered into the kitchen, too drained to even think about food, and there he was, Michael, already reaching for the kettle. "Long day?" he asked, his tone calm but perceptive. "Yeah," I muttered, leaning against the counter. "I think my brain stopped working an hour ago." He gave me a quiet smile and set a mug in front of me. The faint aroma hit me before I even saw it. Chamomile, my favorite. I hadn't asked. I hadn't even mentioned it recently. Yet he remembered. Something inside me shifted. I stared at the steam curling from the cup, my throat suddenly tight. It was such a small gesture, so ordinary, and yet it felt extraordinary. He had remembered. Moments like that began to multiply. I'd find a book I had mentioned sitting on the coffee table, as if he'd pulled it from the shelf just in case I wanted to flip through it again. When I said I was worried about applying to universities, he didn't just say, "You'll be fine." He sat with me, asking what I wanted, helping me see beyond the pressure of expectations. And then there was a protective side, the one that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. One rainy afternoon, I biked over to Ryan's house, soaked through by the time I arrived. Ryan barely looked up from his video game when I dripped water all over the entryway, but Michael appeared with a towel and a frown that was more worried than scolding. "You'll catch cold like that," he said, draping the towel over my shoulders with a care that startled me. "Next time, Call. I'll come get you." It was such a fatherly thing to say, yet it landed differently. His hand lingered just a moment too long on my shoulder, his eyes searching mine, as if making sure I truly was all right. My heart beat harder than it should have, and I forced myself to look away. That night, lie awake in the guest room, I replayed the moment over and over. The towel, his hand, the concern in his voice. And every time I thought about it, I whispered to myself, "Stop it, Daniel. He's your friend's father. It doesn't mean anything. It can't." But the truth was harder to silence. The tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It was gentle, like a current beneath calm water. I found myself seeking his presence without meaning to. When Ryan left the room, I stayed behind. When Michael asked me a question, I listened more closely than I should have. When he laughed, really laughed, it lit something inside me I didn't have words for. It terrified me. I started questioning everything. Was it just admiration? Respect? A craving for guidance? For someone who cared enough to see me? Or was it something more dangerous? Something I couldn't allow myself to name? The lines blurred one evening when my own world felt too heavy. I'd had an argument with my father at home about my future. He wanted business. I wanted writing. Harsh words were exchanged, and I left the house feeling like I didn't belong in it. I ended up at Ryan's, my chest tight, my mind restless. Ryan, oblivious, disappeared upstairs to play his guitar. Michael, however, noticed immediately. "You're quiet tonight," he said, setting his newspaper aside. I tried to shrug it off, but something in his gaze, the patience, the steady kindness, unraveled me. I told him everything. How I felt misunderstood, how suffocating the expectations were, how small I felt in my own home. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss. He just listened, nodding, until my words slowed into silence. Then he said, "You don't have to live your life carrying someone else's dreams. It's hard, yes, but if you spend years walking a path that isn't yours, you'll lose yourself. And you, Daniel, you're worth too much to be lost." The words hit deeper than I expected. My throat ached, my eyes stung. I wanted to thank him, but the gratitude lodged somewhere between my heart and my voice. That night, when I finally fell asleep, I knew something inside me had shifted. The respect I felt wasn't just respect anymore. It had grown into admiration, and admiration was flowering into something warmer, something closer to affection. And that scared me more than anything, because he wasn't just Michael. He was Ryan's father, a man twice my age, someone who had already lived so much life, while I was just starting mine. It felt wrong, and yet it didn't. It felt impossible, and yet undeniable. I tried to convince myself it would pass, that I was just caught in the glow of his kindness, that my heart was confusing gratitude for something else. But the signs, the little gestures, the protective glances, the late-night talks, they were too many, too real. I knew I shouldn't feel this way. I knew, but every time I heard his voice calling my name, every time I saw his smile meant only for me, a whisper rose inside me. What if this isn't wrong? What if this is just love in disguise? And no matter how hard I fought it, I couldn't silence that whisper anymore. I thought the best thing to do was to pull away. Distance, I told myself, was the only answer. If I just stopped spending so much time there, if I built a little space between us, maybe whatever was growing inside me would die quietly. So, for the first time in years, I started saying no to Ryan. When he suggested hanging out at his house, I claimed homework or chores. If he wanted me to come over after practice, I said I was too tired. I even began spending more time at the library, hoping that burying myself in books would keep my thoughts from straying to places they shouldn't. But my plan didn't work the way I imagined. For one, Ryan noticed. "You've been acting weird lately," he said one afternoon, squinting at me over his lunch. "You're avoiding me or something?" "No." I lied quickly. I've got a lot going on. College stuff, you know? He accepted the excuse easily enough, but I knew the truth. It wasn't Ryan I was avoiding. It was his father. Even so, Michael noticed too. Of course he did. He noticed everything. One Saturday evening, after I had dodged 2 of Ryan's invitations in a row, I finally gave in and went over for a short visit. Ryan was busy playing a new video game upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with Michael. It was the first time in weeks I'd been in the same room with him, and I felt the tension like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. I kept my eyes on a glass of water in my hands, determined not to let anything show. But Michael's voice broke the silence, quiet but steady. "You've been distant, Daniel." I froze, my fingers tightening on the glass. "I've just been busy." He shook his head slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening. "No, it's more than that. Did I do something to upset you?" The sincerity in his tone cracked me open in ways I didn't expect. I looked up, and the concern in his eyes made my throat ache. He wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing me. He was worried. I wanted to lie, to brush it off with a joke. But instead, the words tumbled out before I could stop them. "It's not you. It's me. I don't know how to be around you sometimes." The air between us grew heavy. He set down the mug he'd been holding, his expression thoughtful, searching. "Why not?" he asked gently. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to shut my mouth. But the truth had been bottled up for too long. "Because I feel things I shouldn't," I whispered. "Things I don't understand. You're Ryan's dad. You're older. It's wrong. And I keep telling myself it's just respect. But..." I trailed off, unable to say the rest. Silence stretched between us, thick enough to suffocate me. I wished I could take the words back, erase them, pretend nothing had slipped out. But then Michael spoke, his voice low, steady and kind. "Daniel," he said slowly, "there's nothing wrong with feeling." I blinked at him, confused. "What?" "Feelings aren't something we choose. They happen. Sometimes they're surprising. Sometimes they're complicated. But having them doesn't make you bad. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong." He paused, his gaze fixed on mine with a warmth that steadied me. "What matters is what we do with those feelings. How we carry them, with respect, with care." My chest tightened. "So, you know what I mean?" He nodded. A flicker of something unreadable passed over his face, but his voice remained calm. "I know because I feel it too." The world seemed to tilt under me. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself, hardly daring to breathe. You do?" "Yes." He didn't hesitate, though his tone was careful, deliberate. "There's a bond between us, Daniel. I won't pretend otherwise. It's not something I expected, and it's not something I take lightly. But it's there." Hearing it out loud should have terrified me. Maybe it did, a little, but more than fear. I felt relief, like a truth I'd been carrying alone was finally shared. "But how can it be okay?" I asked, my voice cracking. "You're my best friend's dad. People wouldn't understand." "Maybe they won't," he admitted softly. "But right now, I'm not thinking about them. I'm thinking about us. About being honest. That's all." There was no declaration, no dramatic confession of love. Just honesty. Simple, clear, undeniable. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. We sat there in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what came next. The bond was acknowledged, but not labeled. It wasn't something reckless or forbidden. It was something real, something careful, something that needed time. Finally, Michael leaned back and said, almost to himself, "Sometimes life surprises us. What matters is how we honor the surprise." His words lingered long after I left that night. Walking home, my thoughts were a storm. Part of me wanted to run, to bury everything and pretend this had never happened. Another part of me wanted to stay in that kitchen forever, holding on to the rare safety I felt in his presence. The conflict inside me was relentless. I thought of Ryan, of the loyalty I owed him as a friend. I thought of the judgment we would face if anyone knew. But then I thought of Michael's eyes when he told me he felt it too. eyes that didn't carry shame, only truth. And deep down, I realized something I've been afraid to admit. No matter how hard I tried to fight it, this bond wasn't going away. It was growing, steady and patient, waiting for me to find the courage to accept it. I never thought life would hand me so many tests at once. One evening, while I was home alone, I received a phone call that left me shaken to my core. I had applied for a scholarship abroad, the kind of opportunity one had been working toward for years. It was my chance to prove myself, to step outside the shadows and make something of my dreams. But the email arrived earlier than expected, and the answer was a sharp blow. I wasn't selected. It felt like the ground slipped out from under me. I had poured every ounce of myself into preparing, sacrificing nights of sleep and weekends of fun. And yet, here it was, a cold, sterile rejection that seemed to echo all my hidden fears. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe all my dreams were too far away. I shut my laptop and sat on the edge of my bed, numb. My phone buzzed with a message from my best friend, inviting me out, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Instead, I stared at the wall, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. In that silence, I thought of him, my friend's father. I didn't want to, but my heart reached out anyway. It wasn't just that he always seemed to know what to say. It was the calm in his voice, the steadiness in his presence. He had this way of making burdens feel lighter, of making even the darkest days carry a sliver of hope. I don't know what pushed me, but I found myself walking toward their house. My legs moved on their own, as if they knew where I needed to be. When I reached the front door, I almost turned back, ashamed of my neediness. But before I could, the door opened. He was standing there, as though he had been waiting. His eyes softened immediately when he saw me. "You look troubled," he said gently, stepping aside. "Come in." I sat in the living room, the same place where I had shared so many conversations with him. But this time, words stuck in my throat. He handed me a cup of tea without asking what I wanted, and when I glanced down, I realized it was the same blend he knew I preferred. The gesture cracked something inside me. My chest tightened, and to my surprise, tears spilled over before I could hold them back. I quickly turned my face away, embarrassed. "Hey!" His voice was calm, steady. "What happened?" I shook my head, wiping at my eyes. "It's stupid. Just a rejection letter. I thought I had a chance, but apparently I don't. Maybe I was foolish to hope." He sat across from me, his hands clasped together, his gaze unwavering. "It's not foolish to hope," he said softly. "Do you know how many times life told me no, before it finally said yes? More than I care to count. Rejections don't define your worth. They just redirect you." Something in his words, in his tone, broke through my despair. I looked up at him, really looked, and in that moment, the truth inside me rose like a tide I could no longer hold back. My voice trembled. "Why do you always know the right thing to say? Why is it that, no matter how heavy I feel, being around you makes it easier to breathe?" He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "Because I care," he said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. That single sentence undid me completely. My heart thundered in my chest, louder than my thoughts, louder than the storm of guilt I had carried for weeks. Before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. I feel something more for you. Something I shouldn't feel. And I've tried to ignore it. I really have. But tonight, I can't pretend anymore." The silence that followed was terrifying. My hands trembled as I stared at the floor, afraid to see disappointment or anger on his face. But then I felt it, a hand resting gently on mine. When I looked up, his eyes glistened with something I had never seen before. Not pity, not judgment, but a quiet, aching tenderness. "You're not alone in this," he whispered. I felt it too, and I tried to bury it because I thought it was wrong. "You're my son's best friend, and I never wanted to cross a line. But when I saw you tonight, hurting, I realized I can't deny it anymore." A tear slipped down my cheek, but this time it wasn't from sorrow. It was relief, the kind that comes when truth finally finds the air it needs. I swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" He squeezed my hand gently. "We go slow. We stay honest. We keep this respectful. But most of all, we don't need to be ashamed of what we feel. Love doesn't always ask permission before it arrives. Sometimes it just happens. I nodded, my chest warm with a fragile but profound hope. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where this bond wasn't hidden under guilt, but nurtured with care. That night, as I left his house, I carried no shame, only the quiet certainty that my heart had finally spoken and it had been heard. The day I had both dreaded and expected finally arrived. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully you hold them close. My friend, his son, found out. It happened in the simplest, most unplanned way. I had stopped by their house, as I often did, and his father and I were sitting at the kitchen table, laughing over some old story he had shared from his college days. I didn't realize how warm, how natural we must have looked together until I turned and saw my friend standing at the doorway. The laughter froze in my throat. His eyes darted from me to his father, suspicion flickering into realization. The silence stretched like a thin thread ready to snap. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. I felt my heart drop. I wanted to speak, to explain, but no words formed. Before I could try, his father rose slowly, meeting his son's gaze with the calmness I had always admired. "Sit down," he said gently. "We should talk." The conversation that followed was one of the hardest moments of my life. His son listened in silence as his father explained, not with excuses, but with honesty, that something unexpected had grown between us, that it wasn't planned or forced, but real. At first, my friend's reaction was exactly what I feared. His face hardened, and he turned to me with eyes that carried both hurt and confusion. "You're my best friend," he said, his voice low. "And you're my father. How could either of you think this was okay?" The weight of his disappointment crushed me. I opened my mouth, desperate to make him understand. "I never meant for it to happen," I said quietly. "I value our friendship more than anything. But feelings, they came without warning, and I fought them. I really did, until I couldn't anymore." For a moment, he looked away, his jaw tight. Then he pushed back his chair and left the room. The door closed behind him, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than any words. The days that followed were difficult. He avoided me, and when we did meet, his conversations were clipped, guarded. I gave him space, even though it hurt. His father assured me gently, "He just needs time. It's a lot to process." And he was right. Weeks later, I received a message from him, simple, almost casual, asking if I wanted to meet at our usual cafe. My chest tightened with both hope and fear as I walked in and saw him already seated. The first few minutes were awkward, filled with small talk neither of us really cared about. Finally, he leaned back, sighing. "I was angry," he admitted, "mostly because I didn't see it coming. I felt like I was losing both a friend and my father at the same time. But then I watched you too, when you didn't know I was looking, and I realized something." I held my breath, waiting. "You make him happy," he said at last. "Happier than I've seen him in years. And when I thought about it, you've always been like family to us anyway. Maybe this isn't what I expected, but maybe that doesn't make it wrong." Relief surged through me so strongly that I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded, my voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you. That means more than I can ever say." He shrugged, though his smile was small but real. "Just don't make me regret saying that." In that moment, I realized that love, real love, doesn't just demand courage from those who feel it. It also asks for understanding from those around it. My friend's acceptance wasn't instant, but it grew from love for his father and trust in me. And as I walked home that evening, I thought about how strange, how improbable this path had been. To the world, it might still look unusual, maybe even difficult to comprehend. But happiness isn't about fitting into expectations. It's about finding truth in your heart and holding it without shame. And I had found mine. Years later, when I look back on the winding road that brought me here, I often marvel at how unpredictable life can be. If someone had told me in my teenage years that I would one day share a home, a life, and a love with my best friend's father, I would have laughed it off as impossible. Yet here I am, living proof that love cares little for the rules we think should govern it. We live together now, openly and without the shadows of secrecy that once hovered over us. The early days were cautious, every step taken with the awareness of how others might perceive us. Some friends frowned, some neighbors whispered, and there were moments when I wondered if the weight of outside judgment would suffocate what we had built. But love, when it is real, has a quiet resilience. It doesn't shout or demand recognition. It simply endures. And endure it did. At first, only a few close people knew. My friend, after his initial struggle, became our strongest supporter. He may not have understood everything, but he respected the happiness he saw in his father's eyes. Over time, he began to tease us lightly, as if trying to weave normalcy into what once felt extraordinary. "You too are insufferable when you start talking about books," he'd joke, rolling his eyes, but always with a smile. The community around us needed longer to adjust. There were awkward glances in the beginning, muttered comments that drifted to my ears when people thought I wasn't listening. But we faced them with patience. We didn't hide, but we didn't fight either. We just lived, day by day, showing through small actions that our love was built on respect, care, and a deep companionship. Slowly, the whispers faded. People came to see not a scandal, but a partnership, a bond that made both of us better, stronger, and happier. Life with him has been nothing short of a blessing. Our days are filled with the kind of simplicity I once dreamed of but never thought I'd find. Mornings start with shared coffee, the newspaper spread out on the table, his quiet hum filling the kitchen as I prepare breakfast. Evenings bring long walks through the park, where we talk about everything and nothing: work, memories, books, silly observations about the world around us. It's in these little routines that I found the truest form of joy. He has a steadiness that grounds me, a wisdom that continues to inspire me. But more than that, he has a gentleness that never fails to surprise me. He notices when I'm quiet, asks when I'm burdened, and always knows when to hold my hand without a single word. In return, I've learned to cherish him not just as a man who changed my life, but as someone who still deserves laughter, care, and dreams of his own. Together, we've created a space that feels like home, not just a physical place, but an emotional one, a place where I can be wholly myself, without fear of judgment or rejection. Sometimes, when I sit by the window in the evenings, watching the light fade into dusk, I reflect on how love found me. It didn't arrive in the form of youthful infatuation or fleeting attraction. It came quietly, through conversations, shared cups of tea, small gestures, and mutual respect. It grew not out of desperation, but out of a deep recognition. Soul meeting soul in the most unexpected of places. And yes, it still amazes me that this love came to my best friend's father. The very phrase once carried weight in my heart, tangled with guilt and doubt. But time has taught me that love is not bound by titles or roles. It is bound by truth, by the courage to accept what is genuine, even when it defies expectation. My best friend, now building a life of his own, often visits us. He no longer sees us through the lens of strangeness, but through the warmth of family. We've reached a place where laughter flows freely again, where our bond as friends remains unbroken, even enriched by the honesty we've shared. I once believed love had to look a certain way, that it had to follow the rules written by society, that it had to fit neatly into boxes. But life showed me otherwise. Love is not a script. It is a story written fresh each day, unpredictable and profound. And my story, improbable as it once seemed, has become the most beautiful part of my life. If I were to sum it all up, it would be this: I never expected love to come from my friend's father. But life writes its own story, and mine has been filled with love, peace, and unexpected joy. As I sit here now, looking at him across the room, reading his book, glasses perched on his nose, the evening sun casting a gentle glow over his face, I feel an overwhelming gratitude. Not just for him, but for the journey that led me here, for the courage it took to face my heart, for the patience it took to win acceptance, and for the quiet strength that love has given us both. This is my life. This is my love. Unexpected, yes, but true, enduring, and more beautiful than anything I could have ever planned. And I wouldn't trade it for the world.